Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I know it's early in the morning and everyone's still caffeinating, but we're hoping that this session will jolt everyone awake. I'm going to start by having our panelists introduce themselves, give us their name and their affiliation. Want to start?
Yeah, I'm Clayton Fong, the President and CEO of the National Asian Pacific Center on Aging.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Josephine Kalipeni. I use she, hers pronouns. I am the Executive Director at Family Values at Work, and I'm so excited to be here.
Good morning. I'm Lizzy. I'm the Staff Director for Senator Bob Casey on the Senate Aging Committee, and also very excited to be here.
I'm not the least bit excited to be here. It's early.
Old jaded guy.
I'm tired. I don't want to do this, but they pay me to be here, so I guess I am. I'm Rodney. I do Rodney things. I'm also a consultant to the National Council on Aging. A pleasure to be here with you all. See, I got my sincerity up now.
So I want to give everyone an overview while they're here in town with us of what's happening with aging policy in different parts of our government. I know you all are visiting Congress today, or some of you, so I wanted to start there. Lizzy, can you talk to us briefly about what legislation you're working on this year?
Sure. So the big legislative item that I think is of interest to this group is the reauthorization of the Older Americans Act. It is set to expire at the end of this fiscal year, end of September 2024. And there's a lot that we can do to improve and incorporate the lessons learned, particularly from the pandemic since the last reauthorization. I'm happy to say that just this week, the team is passing text of the legislation back and forth and negotiating on it. But it's really a good opportunity, and I don't need to tell all of you this, but a good opportunity to remind members of Congress, our constituents all across the country, about the services that we fund for older adults in their communities. And it just does so much. And reminding people of the links between the services they think about, senior centers, Meals on Wheels, just the items to combat social isolation, that's all under the umbrella of the Older Americans Act is really important. So I know the Hill folks are already off doing their thing, but that's something I'm really excited about. And the team is going to be working on it through this spring and summer. Congress, in these even years when we're off campaigning and doing re-election things, a lot of the official side work kind of quiets down through the summer and fall, but then there's a really good opportunity at the end of the year in the lame duck session to get a lot of things across the finish line. So I'm really hopeful that the work that's happening right now to reauthorize the Older Americans Act is something that we can see progress on by the end of the year. In that kind of same vein of some things that we can look towards the end of the year or later in the year to make progress on. We've seen action in the House and Senate on lowering drug costs and particularly on PBM reform, pharmacy benefit manager reform, and other efforts to lower drug costs. There's a tax bill that again has seen House and Senate action that I'm hopeful that there's action on before the end of the year. And anything else that might pop up, and there's no limit to what older adults can be affected by in the legislation that we touch. So those are some of the big items that we're looking at right now, but there's always a chance of more to come.
And I want to mention the political aspect of your boss is up for re-election, yes?
Yes.
Yeah, so Senator Casey, who leads this committee, is up for re-election in November, so that's definitely a timing aspect to be aware of. A lot of Congress goes on campaign leave, should we call it that? Yeah.
Sure.
That's late
much
summer,
more generous
early
way.
fall, this town is more empty. So Clayton, here, you've done a lot of influencing of legislation. If you're speaking to the room of people who want to influence, what are your tips? Specifically on the legislation Lizzy's talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a range of issues, and I encourage all of you to get out there and talk to your members. while you're here. Who's got T-shirts on? Let me see. There's one. I love the bright color. A couple things I'd say. First, politics is local. So make sure that you connect with your local senators, your local members of Congress, but not just here. Invite them to your senior center. Invite them to your locations, because, and you won't get the member every time, but you'll get staff there, and you'll build that relationship. And 90% of my meetings are with staff people like Lizzy, and they're more, don't get this wrong, don't quote me, but I'd rather meet with Lizzy than the member, because she's the one in there doing the work, and the member will remember. But it's great to have them at your events, but really focus on establishing that working relationship. Two, I would say be bipartisan. Don't assume. If you watch TV these days, you'd think that everybody's evil on both sides, depending on who's, this whole clickbait version of media has really kind of polarized us. But get to know your folks. I'll give an example. I have a couple of Republicans, one in particular, who, some would say, hey, they're not going to be very good on our language access issues, right? But, you get to know one of them, and she's a member of Ways and Means, and, she proudly goes out there and says, English is my third language. Mm-hmm. So get to know them, find out what makes them tick, and find those allies across the aisle. Because when you get support on both sides of the aisle, your legislation, your agenda will be more lasting. And so, those would be the main tips I would say at this point.
Lizzy was talking about Medicare a little bit and drug pricing. I think that leads well into Rodney. Wake alert. I want to move to Medicare. We know that older adults are relying more and more on Medicare coverage alone for health insurance. What do you see as opportunities to make changes to Medicare this Congress, from what Clayton's talking about, a bipartisan perspective, ideas that could potentially win champions on both sides?
Oh, first and foremost, in the current legislative arena, literally today, which may mess with some of your meetings, the Ways and Means Committee is going to be starting conversations about telehealth. Mm-hmm. And so that will be one. How many of you are happy being able to sit at home, talk to somebody, and not get in a car, not having to get dressed up, not having to put on, you know how long it takes me to do my hair? Can you imagine? So having to go through all that, go there, find parking, sit with some of your closest friends, all with snotty noses, and you're like, why am I with these people when my knee aches? And why can't I just talk to my doctor over a device? Okay. The pandemic, for all of its horrors, the silver lining has been the expansion of telehealth in ways that would never have been possible in a previous world. So first and foremost in the world, absolutely we're watching for what happens in telehealth. Now, that would be a good place to be looking on that one.
I want to add, a census said last week, or April, that the percentage of adults aged 65 and older covered by both private health insurance and Medicare decreased from 47.9% in 2017 to 39.6% in 22. So we're definitely seeing an increase in reliance on Medicare. I know that makes more important the price of drugs. Mm-hmm. We are in the middle of Medicare negotiating drug prices. This is happening in the executive branch, not in Congress. Under President Biden. What should people be watching in that process, and especially if they want to influence it?
Not a lot of room to influence in the short term. Mm-hmm. Longer term, certainly there'll be opportunities. But let's talk a little bit about what's going on right now. The Inflation Reduction Act created the opportunity for Medicare to negotiate drug prices, a select group of 10 drugs. What do the 10 drugs have in common? First of all, they're not innovator blockbusters, the ones that are fresh on the market. They've been out there a while, and they lack a certain amount of competition. And so it's a list of drugs. Maybe you've heard some here. I've brought a few of the list here so you can, all right, let's see if I can read this. Eliquis, Jardiance, Xarelto, Januvia, Presbyteria, Firaxaga, Fizbinwala, Entresto, and Engelbert Humperdinck. Now, not
you
all
win
of
the
those
pronunciation award.
not all of those were drugs. I just threw a few in there to make sure you're paying attention. So what'll happen is the administration and the manufacturers will exchange numbers. They'll have intense conversations behind closed doors, and sometime later in the summer, it will get out what the actual price setting will be that will go into place in 2026. Highly, 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 highly probable the manufacturers will scream bloody murder. Why? Because it's in the administration's interest that they scream bloody murder going into an election, which then will lead to opportunities for influence. If you like the direction of this going, then perhaps you should consider that come November. But then at some point the courts will get involved, and we'll see how that turns out, whether or not this is an illegal taking, et cetera, courts, blah, blah, blah.
And last I checked, there were 10 lawsuits from drug makers. I think you mentioned 10 drugs, so I don't know if that lines up.
But real quickly,
industry groups challenging the way that the Biden administration is going about this.
But real quickly, the challenge that I think those current suits face is nothing has actually happened. I think that the real trigger point will be once pricing is announced and you show how much of a hit they take, that's when it's real, that's when the cause, I think, has more sincerity.
Josie, I want to move to you since we're talking about President Biden and the executive branch. President Biden has a very big agenda on caregiving, and we've seen Congress hasn't agreed to his proposals. He's asked for more funding in the billions of dollars. That hasn't happened, and so we got this big executive order with a lot of to-do list items in it about caregiving to make smaller changes to different parts of government and how caregiving works without having to turn to Congress. Can you talk about what you see as some of the highlights of that and what has been most impactful in the year or so since it's been signed?
Sure. So I think it's important to note that when we talk about the CARE agenda, it's really an agenda that impacts everybody. And I think it's important to really name that. And so when we think about partisan issues that have bipartisan impacts, like regardless of who you are in this room, what your party subscription is, when we talk about care and caregiving, everyone is impacted. Whether you're like me, you're a remote caregiver, or you're like my sister who's an in-person caregiver, this is a really important and meaningful issue that impacts over 54 million family caregivers. And that's not to even start to count how many folks they are connected to that are dealing with care and caregiving. And so when I think about the executive order, some of the key things that it did that I think are really worth noting are there's lots and lots of directives being given to multiple agencies, all agencies from Health and Human Services to Department of Labor to really increase access and services and programming specific to family caregivers and working caregivers. We're talking about the workforce of caregivers as well as family caregivers and everything from mental health issues to retraining programs to access to transportation for family caregivers, flexibility being given to veterans in order to name their own family caregivers in that way, and therefore increase access to pay for family caregivers who are often doing that work unpaid. It's also important to know that we have recent precedents for a lot of this stuff. So, there's oftentimes this sort of sense that Congress can't do a thing because of 8 million reasons, right? And the reality is we have key moments of precedence that are as recent as 2021. When I think about the American Rescue Plan, where we instituted one of the first family medical and paid leave plans in this country, where we invested in childcare, we're invested in home and community-based services, all of a sudden, overnight, in the moment of crisis, Congress got together and did the thing that many of us have been asking for decades. Now, granted, a lot of that expired, but this context that Congress can't do these things, we should all sort of laugh at that, right? And so it's important to really consider what the CARE agenda is and what the potential is, both in small ways and big ways. And just to sort of, land the plane, I guess. When we talk about the CARE agenda, we're talking about child care, we're talking about paid family and medical leave, and we're talking about direct health care services and access. Particularly interesting to this room is long-term care and home and community-based services. And all of that is not absent of thinking about the workforce. And so I come into this room wanting to talk a little bit about childcare, and I'm like, why would this room care about childcare? Well, one, I think it's important to note that most family caregivers are growingly becoming sandwich generation caregivers. That means they're caring for a child and caring for an adult. And I think about how the workforce for the care that we need, both on the child care side and on the home care side and long-term services and support side, is really, really important. And I wonder who in this room, you don't have to tell on yourself, is between 40 and 47. Okay, it's important to know that, because let's assume that you're in perfect health. We all know that the older you get, the more likely it is that you need care. And if we're not thinking about the child care aspect, those folks are going to be your workforce pool in 20 years. And so we have to think about both angles of the age spectrum, just because of the continuity of care that we have to think about and the impact that it has on family caregivers, particularly that are stuck in the middle. So the care economy agenda is incredibly important. And the last thing I'll just say is executive orders are really important. Sometimes they have teeth, sometimes they don't have teeth. Sometimes they are important trajectory setters. And really importantly, we all know what it means when a key public figure is using their bully pulpit to talk about our issues. And we know what that means for advocacy. We know what that means for community conversations. We know what that means for sort of really raising the flag and sounding an alarm on issues that are really, really important to us. And so even in that way, executive orders are really, really important part of the legislative process.
We've been going through an alphabet soup here. Washington is known for its acronyms. Rodney was mentioning Inflation Reduction Act, which goes by IRA.
Yep.
I wouldn't have named it that if I were naming the bill. But that bill includes the Medicare drug pricing debate and negotiations. And then Josie mentioned American Rescue Plan, which goes by ARP. I know this community, that acronym is used for other things as well. But the American Rescue Plan was President Biden's COVID package. So a lot of the caregiving money and policy was tucked into the COVID package and has since expired. Am I saying that right?
Yep.
Okay. So Congress, are there any specific actions, I want to start with Clayton, that you're watching from the president in the next couple months? We're in an election year. He's up for re-election. In case you missed it. I don't think you have. But what are you watching for from the president? We've been talking about executive action and how he's used his own authority when Congress hasn't acted. What are you watching for?
Well, you're giving me a chance to talk about our agenda, which is more specific to Asian American elders. 80% speak other than English at home.
Okay.
50 to 60% don't speak English well. Fully 1/3 have no adult in the household that speaks English. For us, a really important issue for access is the language bridge. Mm-hmm. He just, the Biden administration just issued final rules on, this is going to get alphabet soup, on ACA, Affordable Care Act, that addresses the language issue. Mm-hmm. But it is done, that because it's legislation, has the ability to stick. Mm-hmm. What I worry about are the executive orders, because the executive orders really are, shall we say, perishable, is maybe the right word. And so I think it's really important when you find a great executive order that you like, make sure that you find a way to take that action and turn it into ideally bipartisan legislation. And so we're looking at language access. The caregiver executive order is a real big deal. For us, we're looking at an inventory of, we're marrying the two together and looking for an inventory of linguistically and culturally competent long-term care, community-based and institutional services. Right now, if someone is looking for services for mom, but we'd like a provider that speaks a language or what have you, there is no there's no directory, inventory. We can give them a broad list, but they have to start all over again with, well, I'd love someone that speaks Chinese or Korean, or makes a little Chinese food, or even can cook rice. But those are really important things, and I'd be remiss, you also have a flyer on your table of our most recent
Way to plug
caregiver
it.
initiative. And it is about, it's so prevalent. It's for Asian families and their experiences. It was done in collaboration with a award-winning documentary producer who spent 19 years as a caregiver. And so her insights really showed through that. And so there's a trailer and whatever, but I merely want to say that because it's such a prevalent issue. Something like, if you're 50 or above, you're very likely to be a caregiver yourself, or for sure a family member is. And so this is something that cuts across the aisle, cuts across demographics, and there really is an ability to build strong, bipartisan, enduring support for these initiatives.
And he was speaking about turning executive order into legislation, which is ideal for any issue in Washington.
Yes, 100%.
I know from being at the White House, the first days of the administration, all we were covering was
Flurry of executive orders.
executive orders and taking out the previous administration's executive orders. So as we've seen presidents take more action to use their own authority, it's made things less permanent. Would you agree?
Yeah.
Lizzy, I want to jump to you as our Congress representative. If someone wants to influence that, what gets your attention? What captures the attention of members, particularly in a re-election year?
Yeah, so what I would build on what Clayton said earlier to really be thinking about the staff over the next 6-8 months, while a lot of the focus is going to be on campaigns and on elections. I was just telling some of our other panelists from my office as we think about what the year ahead looks like. We obviously are looking to re-elect our leaders and maintain and build Democratic majorities. But we're also planning for what are the different eventualities. What might January 2025 look like? And it's very unpredictable. And we have a lot of different factors that we're looking at this year. Who will be in control in the White House? Who will be in control in the House? Who will be in control in the Senate? Who are the new members that we may have in the Senate, and what backgrounds do they bring on both sides of the aisle? So that kind of planning is really happening over the next several months. And it won't surprise you, Congress isn't very popular. So we do a lot of work to think about ways that we can combat kind of what is that public image of Congress, what is what you see on cable news as far as the most partisan sides getting their headlines and frankly doing fundraising off of that. How can we bring some of that work to that bipartisan work and that incremental progress back? So we are thinking about, maybe we can't advance a massive caregiving agenda in the next Congress or in the next 6 months, but we can start to build places where there might be bipartisan agreement. And caregiving, but I would say broadly, aging policy is something that, again, members of Congress fit into that demographic and feel personally. So we hear a lot about, I'm struggling to find care for my parents, or, I work in this space and even I can't figure out my Medicare plan. So just thinking about how personal a lot of these things can be and what can we do to make incremental progress across a lot of these spaces, and where can we find some bipartisan agreement that advances our policy agenda forward. The other thing that we are looking at, and just to throw more acronyms in here, so as Clayton mentioned, we're seeing a lot of rules coming out of the Biden administration right now. That is because the Congressional Review Act, known as the CRA, allows Congress to basically disapprove of rules that the executive branch puts out, but there's a specific window in which they can do that. So what the executive branch is doing right now is putting out a bunch of rules to try and get ahead of that disapproval window. So we're seeing a ton of activity there, and going through thousands of pages of regulations and trying to understand what's in them. But just as executive orders don't have permanence, there are parts of regulations that also don't have permanence. So it's also seeking opportunities where we can in regulations to actually enact in law things that we think are of particular importance. So just one example right now is in the Older Americans Act, there's a lot of discussion around how we define greatest social need. That's a term that's in the law. That's a term that was further defined in a recent rule that the Administration for Community Living put out. So then we're thinking about, okay, we have this reauthorization. Are we going to do more or kind of codify what the text of the law should say related to what the rule said? So that's just an example of kind of all the different factors that we're thinking about as these rules are coming out, but also just thinking about how do we plan for the future.
And when she's talking about the Congressional Review Act, I don't think that was a law that was widespread known in Washington until a few years ago. It was something that the Congress used to undo President Obama's regulations several years ago now when they came into office. I want to jump to Rodney, looking for him. How do you talk to Republican members in this day and age?
Oh, you gave me the easy question.
Lizzy is talking to us about what speaks to her as
Sure.
a staffer on the Democratic side. How do you capture the attention of a Republican member?
So one of the things I would point out is that the issues that we're talking about aren't A1. They're not leading the nightly newscast. Okay, I'm old, I remember that. That we're not talking about things that are the really divisive issues. We're talking about ships. We're talking about OAA. We're talking about things that are, again, these aren't the ones dividing Congress, that aren't leading them to be, taking up arms against each other rhetorically. And so taking it back down to, this is simple, this is important, this is constituent based. Tying it back to the real people in their districts. That's what matters most. And that doesn't matter whether or not you put on a red shirt, a blue shirt, or a teal shirt. Okay? That's what matters. The basics of nuts and bolts constituents. That's where you start any conversation. And I don't think that one, again, it's a great place to go with Republicans, but it's also a great place to go with Democrats.
Lizzy was talking about inviting members to come see your work, or inviting staff, Clayton has said, has been really helpful. How do this audience, how can they do that?
Well, you ask. Literally, if you're there today,
Well, if you're trying to build constituent awareness.
Yeah, nuts and bolts. Okay, most members have something called an executive assistant or a scheduler. That is the person the member hates more than anyone else in their office. Am I wrong?
No, you're right.
No, hates that person. Why? Because that's that person who controls them from the moment they wake up to the moment they go to sleep. Wait, I ran for office. No, I went through all this. I went into so many Waffle Houses and acted like I cared about everybody in there just to get to this town and have you tell me what to do. That's the person. You need to talk to that person on your way out, get their card, contact them. Because that person and a counterpart perhaps back home has a job, which is to make sure that the member never has any free time. Because members with free time are bad things. Very bad things. That is a complete bipartisan statement. The worst thing, what can I do today? If that answer is not already written out for them, you've messed this up as a congressional office. So then you contact the person, say, and make it attractive. What's attractive? We have lots of constituents. under our roof who would love to see you. And it may not happen the next day. It may happen when they're in the town where you got to do this and 4 different unrelated events, but you're in the same place. And then you could end up working it out. That's how you go about it. But it starts with making the contacts. And if you can't get at that person, start with the person you are meeting at. Because, Lizzy, you can connect them with the right people. That's how it works.
Talking about the executive branch, so you all are going to see members of Congress in person today. I know us as reporters, we appreciate that too. I can walk up to a member and talk to them. But the White House, the agencies are not that way. Josie, how do you go about influencing that mechanically? Are there certain examples of what people in the audience can do to get their viewpoint across to the administration?
Yeah, so I think a few different things. I think, like Rodney said, it's really, and Clayton also raised, is really identifying their personal interests and figuring out the best language to use that connects with people's personal interests. So I think that's really, really important. The other thing that I think is important is doing general relationship mapping. You all are in communities with organizations, with folks who have relationships that you probably haven't tapped into. And I'm often surprised how in a room of people, they're 10 steps away from someone who's in the White House. And it might not be the president's chief of staff, but you work your way through relationships and meetings in that way to the right person. And it's often, it's a long game. You don't show up as an advocate or as someone wanting to talk about an issue and get a meeting with the president. Trust me, 20 years into this work, right? It just doesn't work that way. But you do build relationships over time as you're talking about issues that are really important. I think it's also important to go back to the idea that it has to be constituent-based. It's important to tell members of Congress and to tell the administration, folks that work for the administration, that you are representing XYZ particular population that cares about this, that are voters, that are folks that mobilize voters. I think that is really, really, really important. And the other thing that I find interesting about the administrative advocacy work is that unlike your member of Congress who's first going to care about the person that's in their state, the administration is going to care about anyone in America, well, ideally, right? And so it's less of like a where you are from and more about speaking representatively, both on your experiences and the experiences of the people that you represent. I think that's really, really important.
Can I just real quick just point out, you said something that's really important that this room needs to understand, and that is the transactional nature, okay? And that is, Ramsey's sitting here. Ramsey, they're gonna call you. We need you up on stage. We need you at a meeting. We need you to sit here. Why? Because you represent these folks, and what we say to you will get out. You described it perfectly. That transactional nature creates the windows for you to have those conversations.
That's absolutely right, and it's on our communities to then show up. Don't put Ramsey on a stage saying she can turn out 300 people, and then when she calls y'all aren't nowhere to be seen. That's not a good look for Ramsey, and that really shortens the credibility of our communities. And the other thing I just want to say that's really important is this is not a one-time thing. It's not a one-time call, it's not a one-time tweet, it's not an attend this conference once, it's not a meet with your Congress member once, it's not a meet with a staffer once. When you get a chance to talk to Lizzy, ask her how many people she sees a week. And if she's not hearing from you all regularly, if you all aren't in this consistently, it's hard to really make that inroads. So it's really important to understand that it is an ongoing, ever-going process. And if you're going to tap out, you have to build a bench of the person that's going to take your place. That's really important. Everybody's going to, at some point, folks get tired. You don't want to do the calls. You don't want to do the thing. But if you're not building a bench for the person to take on once you're tapping out, then that leaves a deficit in the voices that need to be represented around the issues that we need represented. And the last thing I'll say is we all know the important political states. It's a campaign year. You can almost map it with your eyes closed where campaign visits are going to be, You all have representation in those states. You all have senior centers in those states. You all have area agencies on aging in those states. Those are important constituents during a campaign, during campaign time. Folks are going to want that photo op, that public appearance opportunity. And so if you know that these are the top X states that almost every candidate is likely to make some kind of stop in, you want to start connecting with the folks in your community. The more you're connected, the more you get an invite into those spaces. And you have to be ready, you have to be very ready to move quickly. As we all know up here, it's often a 2-day notice if you're lucky. And so all of those, it's really, I think the underlying thing that I want people to walk away with, it's about consistent relationship building, both with the offices and with folks in your community who are connected to other people.
Can I add a story to that?
Sure.
We recently, just had Monday, I had a meeting, a small group of folks that met with the Secretary of HHS. How did that come about? We were part of a coalition. It happens to be Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander Heritage Month. But I think part of the invitation and memorability of it was I engaged in a meeting with Ramsey a number of months ago, and it was an IRA meeting, and it was more of a listening session, probably more than anything else. But I walked in with a pile of clips, this high, of coverage that we had gotten around many of the things that the administration cared about and we cared about. And I got to say, one of the things that happened was the secretary said, oh my gosh, we really need to do a better job of reaching out to the Asian American media. And so what that ended up happening was it resulted in follow-up meetings with a lot of his communication staff. And that kind of, so the ball rolls a little bit downhill easier than it rolls uphill. Fast forward to this meeting on Monday, I volunteered to lead the conversation on language. But you know, I did my homework with him. He, as a teenager, translated for his parents.
Secretary Becerra.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I just thanked him and said, you know, this executive order is earth-shattering for us as an advocate that we've not had this. It's a starting point, right? And to be honest with you, the quote in our press release was how unique an opportunity it was, because for the first time we had a secretary of HHS who grew up in a household that spoke other than English as their primary language. Huge compliment, but it's a compliment for us and it advances our agenda.
Yeah.
But also remember that besides constituent relations, media is a big deal. And so, so I think find ways to find common ground and toot each other's horn, I guess is what I would say. And I think that you'll find a lot of traction when you do something like that. And to be very frank, I won't get into but then we followed up. And what happens is the staff will follow up with items out of that meeting, and then the secretary's office will distribute memos for meetings and follow-ups. That's a way more effective way to open the door in the, shall I say, the bowels of bureaucracy.
I like that. Can I use it?
Because the ball's rolling downhill rather than trying to roll the ball uphill. So it's just a story around how do you kind of effectively work. It's different. Congress is smaller offices. They're more responsive. You know, the executive branch is huge. You got to find a way to crack through. And so little ways like that will help.
Can I add one thing, Courtney?
Yeah.
I also just, you know, we're talking about the national level because we're in DC. You all are doing Hill visits today. I do just want to put a plug into the politics and policies and your elected officials at the state level, from your governor all the way down. Even if executive orders turn into legislative language and they become bills that pass, those are directives to the states to implement. And if you don't have the relationships with your governor's office, your state agencies, implementation, regardless of what Congress has done, regardless of what the administration has done, implementation becomes really, really challenging and difficult. We've seen states leave money on the table because implementation at the state level and because of state electeds' personal, you know, and political aspirations or perspectives about particular issues. So these are all related functions, and they're so interconnected that the idea that we have such high turnout in national voting cycles and not local and state voting cycles is really problematic. And the idea that you all are state folks also have to have those relationships at the state level. You need to be able to say, hey, have you heard this thing from Department of Labor? Right? Have you heard this thing from HHS? Have you heard this thing from your member of Congress? Because those things become directives that states have to implement. So those relationships are as equally important.
How many of you are from Wisconsin? No one in the room?
somebody.
Oh, yeah.
She's in.
So President Biden is headed your way today. He spends more time in Pennsylvania than any other state. Anybody Pennsylvania? Okay. When they're talking about, Senator Casey is from Pennsylvania too. I'm sure you get bombarded with Senate ads already. But those of you who come from swing states will probably know it, but so many of the members of the administration, like what Clayton's talking about, also make those state visits. And a lot of times if you track the patterns, they're to those same swing states. I track so many visits to Philly by members of the administration. And
The vice president is there today.
there we go. That's why I'm here with you all, because he's in Wisconsin and she's in Philly. But the politics matter. I know you all know that, but I think these speakers have emphasized it. Okay, lightning round. What is the one thing you want this audience to take home with them?
Keep trying. Keep trying. You don't win on the first shot. It's not a one-shot wonder. It's consistency, messaging. I'm proud of my nickname, the language nag. I've been doing it for 40 years. It was way uphill battles 30, 40 years ago. It's a little easier these days, but just keep trying. And what happens is Congress can get crazy or whatever, but this is not lightning, but but just keep trying. And what'll happen is the stars will line up the right way, and if you're in the queue, boom, it just happens all of a sudden.
Josie, what do you got?
I think for me, the key takeaway is that there's a role for everybody. You might not be, the staffer for the Senate Aging Committee, but you might be the primary caregiver in your family and need to have those conversations at a dinner top table about what you're going through, what it means, and how the systems and policies are making the role that you have to play even more challenging. Even that level of tabletop conversations start a domino effect that really continues to create the ripple that we need to create the tipping point at the state level and at the federal level. So there's a role for everybody, whether you're the researcher, the editor, the social worker, the primary family caregiver, or the remote caregiver. Whatever it is, there's a role for you to play in really finding that spot that allows you to use your personal experience, which is your power, to set some level of activation, however big or small, is incredibly, incredibly significant to what we have to accomplish.
I would say, remember, you are gold for members of Congress and administration officials. You offer a wonderful photo op. You can have a senator calling bingo, or meeting with a group of seniors. And this is a really important constituency for every single reason. And so use that to your advantage and continue to invite members, invite staff to come and visit you and see you. And really, politics is professional gossip. So you have so much information. I know seniors like to gossip. You have so much information that you can share. Like them telling a member of Congress who's there, hey, by the way, that hospital was really great, or you should go visit that hardware store, or just be the community's source of information. Again, gold for members of Congress.
Advocacy, constituent level advocacy, is as simple as what I would say to my daughter when she was in middle school, when I would drop her off and she would get out of the car and I would roll down the window and I would scream at the top of my lungs, "Make a friend," which is one day why I will end up in a 0-star nursing home. because that will never go away. But that is the core of relationship building. Think of it that way. You're here to make a friend. Lizzy has been here a while. I did 2 decades up there. You meet people, you know people, and you build the relationship. That's the core of constituent level advocacy.
Yeah. And shout out to our ASL team.
I want to say thank you so much for being with us. I think from the audience, I saw some engagement. Thank you for joining us. We're going to wrap.
Thank you.
I'm going to invite up to the stage Ramsey Alwyn, who is going to introduce a video.
Do we get up?
Can we have applause for our panelists? These were some really smart people. Thank you for